Yeah.
All right. Is the volume okay? Can people hear me?
Can everyone hear us good? Yep,
Ashley
okay.
says yes.
Can you hear the tea boiling in the background? That'll stop soon, I'm hoping.
Can't hear that.
So contrary to last time, I'll go around the room and allow people in the room to introduce themselves. I'm Paul Tomascak.
Jessica Harris.
I'm Carol Willard.
John Kane,
Scott Cunningham.
Eric Helquist.
And thank you
and
for
online we
joining us
have
remotely. We have
Ashley Moore.
Ben Obo.
Clarence here.
Zoraida Lopez.
Well, thanks for joining. This is not intended to be any sort of structured anything. As a consequence of the events of the spring, I asked John if he might be interested in conversations related to AI in the classroom, and particularly the potential impacts on academic integrity. And he, for some reason, said yes. So this is it. As an associate dean, the associate deans deal with all of the academic integrity issues, and this semester we saw the first of those, and certainly not the last. And so we wanted to say a little bit about process and really just open it up to for people to talk about this, because I'm certainly not an expert on either the technical side of it or the philosophical side of it. I have some observations, but I think that this is a sufficiently evolving topic that that it's good to talk at this point, regardless of whether we've come to any sort of conclusions about anything. So the associate deans have to deal with questions like, can I penalize this student because I think that they can fill in the blank? And the fill in the blank can be, I think that they cheated on this exam, but I didn't actually see them cheat on the exam. So that can be something of a gray area, but it also can be, I think that they've manufactured this paper. I don't think that the student wrote this paper. And in that case, it could be because the student bought a paper from somewhere, or they used ChatGPT or whatever else. And I think it puts us, from the standpoint of the instructor, from the standpoint of the institution, in a strange position, because we want our academic integrity cases to be clear cut, for there to be no real grounds for appeal. Occasionally, students will appeal, and generally the appeals don't go anywhere because the cases are solid. But if you suspect that a student has used AI to write a paper, or a portion of a paper, or something, you really have to have, from a procedural standpoint, you have to have evidence that is conclusive, or at least is convincing. And at least at this point, the AI detectors or the safe assigns or the whatever else is, I don't think that they are giving us what we need for that to be a criterion. And from what I've seen, and John supports this, there's a lot of false positive. So it is unfortunate that someone can be a clever cheater and use ChatGPT output and do a little bit of rewording of things and have it be effectively undetectable. But I think that's where we are. I think that the clever cheater is someone who we're not going to catch at this stage under most circumstances. And there are certainly individual cases where that might not be the case, but I don't think that we are in a place where we can just use a tool and say safe assign says 97% or 90% or 40% or whatever percent is generated artificially, and use that as our only criterion for whether we levy a penalty against a student. So my experience with this in my class this past semester, I was able to detect it because the student wasn't an artful cheater. I don't think that they were really trying to cheat. I think that they were being foolish and admitted using the tool, but it was also something that was not hard to see. John had a recent case of a student who really took it to the extreme of using ChatGPT and so completely not looking at the output, just copying it and pasting it, that they didn't see that the first line in some of the responses said something effectively.
As an AI tool, I cannot address this question. If you're not access to this data.
Yeah. So if you have someone, if you have a situation like that, absolutely, that is,
Blatant.
yeah, that is something that
Yeah.
we will support to the end of the earth. But other than that, if you have a situation where you have a piece of writing that you don't think the student produced, have the conversation, talk to the student about it, talk to them about your concerns. If they are an inveterate cheat, they're just going to deny, and unless you have a greater level of evidence, then perhaps you're stuck not being able to do anything for that incident. But I think at least at this point, there are a lot of students who are using this tool, these tools, and they're not explicitly trying to cheat. And so if you have a conversation that is, look, I'm not trying to bust you, I'm trying to understand why this writing is so much different than this other piece of writing of yours, or why this section of this paper looks so different from these other sections. I think that if you're open-minded or at least productive-minded about this, that you stand the chance of a student saying, well, yeah, I did use this. And at that point you can use a penalty, but it elevates the discussion. It's not just us versus them at that point. It's okay, what can we learn from this? Why did you use this? Why do you think you had to use this? What could you do to avoid doing this? What could you do to, to potentially leverage the tool in a way that would help you understand the assignment better? And then, that's where we would all like to be. So I think, as with anything, if you go at this from a pure punitive standpoint, you're going to drive the inveterate cheaters or the people who are on the margins into hiding, and it's not going to be any more productive. So that's my spiel. So, Carol, do you have any words of wisdom to add?
I don't know if they're words of wisdom, but I think it is important to document when you have those conversations with students, and so that there is a pattern. It's one thing if a student does it once and it's gee, I didn't really know, or oops, and then we see a pattern of that. And the way to document that across courses is to use Maxian, if that's the route that you want to use. But I think it's important to document that and to support students in understanding that we have to be savvy consumers of this technology, just like with other technological advances. So,
and that's one of the key points over all academic integrity. You don't have to penalize a student when you're certain or quasi-certain that a violation has taken place. If you put in the violation report and tell the student, I'm not penalizing you for this, I still have grave doubts that this is your own work, you can put the violation report in basically as a placeholder, so that if the student violates in the next class that they're in, or the next year or 2 years later, there is some record in the system, so that if the student really has all this time been trying to get away with stuff and they're finally caught a little bit more conclusively, that's something that an associate dean can look at later on and say, this person needs to be talked to. We need to do more than just an individual course academic penalty. We need to do more than just give them a 0 in this assignment. And that it certainly, again, is at least a conversation. It's at least a situation where someone else is talking to that student about the fact that this is serious. Your instructors have taken this seriously. We take it seriously. Here's the potential for what can happen at this point. But we can't do that if no one reports. And there are large areas in campus where people don't report. And I think part of it is because people don't understand the value, the sort of legacy value of reporting. And there, we are all sympathetic to students. We don't want to harm someone's future. No one should be thinking about that. You should be thinking about, this is something that is concerning in the moment. I'm going to put this placeholder in here so that if there is something that happens in the future that I have no part of, that there's a record that this happened. And so if a student uses a tool that they're not supposed to, or does something else, it is part of the body of work, and we can do something more serious about it, which could include at that point suspension, which, that's, nobody wants the student who is the serial cheat in their classes. So we want to be able to deal with them.
Is there recommendations for what maybe faculty should maybe put in their syllabi about AI and how to approach that in maybe our first discussions in the class, first day of classes, about how to kind of have these discussions with students about what the expectations are? Is there a language we should be approaching? Because I know, like you said, there's kind of these fine lines here with this right now. So how do we approach this with our syllabi? Is there anything that we particularly should have in there?
I
Or
think that that's a crucial point. And it's something that, regardless of what you decide for your individual class, the conversation is critical to have. And unfortunately, in my class, we had the conversation and the student went and did it anyway. But that aside, having the conversation about what your expectations are, if you're writing a discussion post, if you're writing a response paper, if you're writing a research paper, regardless of what the level of the offense that the student might perceive it, you need to make them understand clearly where you stand on, if you're doing a written assignment. I don't care if it's a 1-line thing that you're just jotting down, or if it's a 10-page paper. I want this to be exclusively your own work. So, maybe that leads to the class, someone in the class saying, well, what about AI? And you can talk about where you see that fitting in. If you see that fitting in nowhere, it's the point where you can say, I don't see any role for this in my class. So, you can lay down your position really clearly. If you see that it's something that could be used in a context in a particular way, then you can talk about that, and you can say specifically, for instance, if you use ChatGPT for something, I want you to point out that you've used it, point out what is yours versus what is generated, and fill in the blank. Maybe it's, if you use it, then you have to follow it with a similar number of words of your own to describe that you actually understand what has been transmitted. I think there are a lot of ways of having it not just be a don't ever use this, because the don't ever use this very frequently ends up being a, okay, don't ever use it, or don't ever get caught using it.
Yeah.
I think having the conversation, again, ends up being important. And there will be students who are always going to be subverting, and that's, that's just the nature of humankind. But we're not trying to deal with those students. We will hope that those students get their just desserts at some point, but you're trying to deal with the student who is not explicitly trying to subvert things, but maybe they would use this, and maybe they think that it's okay to use it for this little thing, or that if I use it in this clever way, it's going to be okay. I think if you make it clear and in particular, if you have the discussion about why you're doing it this way versus some other way, you have the greatest chance of students buying in. So what do you think, home audience?
As we all turn to the screen here.
I have a question. Did you guys get a lot of reports of cheating this way this semester?
In CLAS, we didn't get that many. I talked to a lot of people about it and their suspicions and their concerns, but as far as actual reports, John's was one of the very few.
And that was an exception in that it was very, very explicit.
Yeah.
I noticed the quality of student writing on essay responses improved pretty dramatically over the course of the spring semester in ways that couldn't really be predicted based on their past writing in the course. But it was, again, it's really difficult to detect on many types of applications.
Yeah.
In the School of Ed, we had one official report of it, but plenty of anecdotal storytelling about it. And in most cases that I was aware of, the instructor said something to the student and the student said, yeah, I was really pressed for time or whatever. And the instructor said, well, go back and do it on your own then, and there wasn't really a consequence per se. And that wasn't documented in an official way, except for that one case. But I think that I've heard rumors of a lot of people thinking that it's being used.
Yeah, and what you said, John, I think is shared by a lot of instructors that, I can't prove anything, but I see that the level of writing, the quality of writing has gone up. And, that doesn't happen overnight. That it doesn't happen over the course of a semester for that population. So you can either continue to grind yourself into this and say, my assignments are the best, and we're just going to keep plowing ahead, doing things the way that we've been doing them. And, and those students who cheat are just hurting themselves, which they are. But you could also make changes to the way that you're delivering content. You can lean into it to some extent, and you can use it. And the problem with that is that it requires you to do more work. It's fundamentally more difficult to generate a new assignment than to continue using the assignment that you've been using for the last 15 years. One could posit that you shouldn't be using the same assignment for 15 years straight, but who am I to dictate the academic freedom limitations? But I think that this is a good moment for everyone to re-examine what they're giving, especially when it comes to writing, what you really want students to get out of a written assignment, and think of how this could be different. How can you do this to either incorporate AI or to do things that make it harder for students to use some sort of generative technology? And it's possible for you to say you have to use ChatGPT for this part of the assignment. The second part of the assignment is your reflection on what you got back from this. Does this response that you get when you put in this, this prompt, does it make sense? Does it square with what we've learned in the class? There are ways of doing it that push the student toward learning as opposed to pushing a student toward trying to find a way to get around doing an assignment.
And maybe rather than rethinking a complete assignment, it's about tweaking assignments to acknowledge or incorporate the AI, or as you said, Paul, to like, here's a piece that you should use AI for, here's a piece that I want as your response to that generated text, or of this, everything that you cite in this reader response, or everything that you assert in this reader response has to have a citation. And so the students are going on and looking for those citations or looking for another source for that information. And so what's the purpose of that writing assignment in the first place, right? So that may be a way to tweak those assignments.
At least at the current moment, the technology is not good with things that are very recent. So if you're in a field that has recent examples, then leverage that. Use the example of what went on in the stock market over the last year. Use the example of the recent finding in zoology in the last year. Use something that has a level of currency that will make it difficult for the technology to come up with something, or if it comes up with something, it's going to be especially obvious that it is not authentic writing.
And have students compare and contrast something with something that they've read in their textbook, because
Yeah,
it would not
exactly.
generally have access to that, or have it analyze arguments in a video or a podcast. Although if it provides them with a
Image.
summary of the podcast using some of the tools that are now available, that it can do that. But
Or an
there are lots of
image.
ways to, which are not bad anyway, having
Yeah.
them develop these higher level
Yeah.
comparison
Yeah,
skills.
using images and
Images
using, and in the sciences, using graphs. And here's a figure from a paper.
Which now there are plugins that will interpret graphs and so forth. And there is a plugin to bring Wolfram Mathematica in to solve math equations, which was something it did not do very well initially.
And that's one of the things about talking about this in very concrete terms, is that it is changing so quickly and improving so quickly that there are things that are just hard to be out in front of from a policing standpoint. So I think that the better tactic, the better thing to put your effort into is not policing as much as rethinking.
And I think to your point too, about, the student, who is the, serial cheater, only hurting themselves. John and I had a conversation with someone in the spring semester who had conversations with two students who were leaving, that were high performers, because they felt like the rigor wasn't there too. So it's like seeing students who, are consistently doing well and putting no effort in, and our students who are really putting effort in and, not cheating, not doing these things, who are just, not wanting to stay because they don't see the value in seeing other students not putting, I think those are things to think about too, in kind of our climate with our students, and kind of, we don't normally hear about, students leaving because of that issue, right? So that was a little different in
Yeah.
hearing that. So those are things too to think about in regards to our assignments and our rigor and
We don't want to lose
refining.
anyone, but we especially don't want to
not
lose
our
the
high
good
performers.
ones.
Right, exactly. So yeah, just overall refinement, and thinking of different ways to, and I think it was the writing, what was the writing session today? I forget the title of it, but we were talking about,
Writing
papers,
assignments, yeah.
and ChatGPT creates a great outline, right? And it can really help lay the foundation for students. And you can talk a little bit about that, as opposed to, if you're struggling developing like buckets for a paper, it can help you with ideas. You don't need to have it write your entire paper. There's other ways that it could be, helpful and useful as a tool that you can use it. It's not forbidden, right? Because of course they're going to use it if you tell them it's forbidden. There's other ways to, kind of implement it into your classroom, that hopefully they will use that rather than, the other way.
What else? What other thoughts do you have?
I do have a question. So I guess if, let's say, the GPT-0, right? If something is flagged that it is considered AI, and we were to bring it, is that a credible way to say this is not the student's work?
So
'Cause we
far,
know
the best
that-
detection seems to be turn it in, and they were reporting originally a 1% false positive rate. Now it's up to 4% with more extensive testing, and that's only going to get worse and worse as these tools get better and better.
Yeah,
So,
so then with that
and
being
that's a
said,
false positive. The false negative is dramatically higher. Over 50% of the stuff generated by ChatGPT is not detected by these algorithms. So you'll be missing most cases, and you will be accusing a few people who did not engage in this.
right. So with that being said, what does that look like? Because then there's the potential that there's a student that it's saying it's AI, and there's a student that really it's not. Is that something that's been talked about?
But I think
You
it's,
know,
it's the same for any intellectual integrity issue where you're,
right.
Well, you
you
can't
talk to a
document
student
yourself.
and,
Yeah.
the student has a plausible reason or certainly, if you can't conclude, as Paul said, if it's not conclusive that the student was dishonest about something, we're not going to, we can't as an institution,
Right,
boot somebody out of the college kind of a thing because we suspect something.
right. So
But
even-
again, it's those conversations, and even if you document that conversation, like I'm suspicious about this, and then it's kind of, as Paul said, a placeholder, and it's this pattern of behavior that may be indicative of something further down the line, and you wouldn't necessarily know that as an individual instructor, and that's why it's so important for individual instructors to document it for that reason.
So then it's safe to say that we, as soon as we go, wouldn't be saying, oh, GPT-0 says it's AI, so we are gonna punish a student for that.
Yeah, that would be
Because I
hard.
know there's been some, I have a colleague at a different institution where that thing, so I'm just,
Well, yeah, ChatGPT 0 though
Is
is
not
not
effective,
very
right.
reliable. It worked pretty well with GPT 3, but not with 3.5 or 4. And it's going to do even worse with 5, which will be coming out in another month or two.
And I don't know do you know, John, of any system that really does
there's
that
really not.
in a reliable way?
No. And
So-
turn it
So
in
there's
is
no-
probably
yeah.
the best, but again, that's based on detection of ChatGPT. It's not clear that it will work as well with some of the other tools that are coming
Yes.
out.
So as of, there's no tool as of now that we would use to say, if there's none, there's none. Yeah, this was a discussion and that's what we, okay.
I believe so.
Yeah.
Don't you think, Paul?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
And people have asked, well, you need to change the policy now to include this. And we will, the policy is always evolving, but I don't think that the policy as it stands is ineffective, because
Right.
although it doesn't enumerate artificially intelligent, generated text, it talks about students turning in work that is not their own. And so that, I don't see that there's a problem.
Mhm.
And that this is something that a student attempted to use to shield themselves. Actually, the parents attempted to use to shield their precious student from being busted on this. And it was, wow, your policy doesn't mention this at all. Well, yeah,
And the student I talked to 2 days ago, 3 days ago, who used the same sort of an argument and said, the only work you submitted in this course in the first 2 weeks was submitted from ChatGPT. You have submitted nothing of your own.
I have another question for you.
Sorry.
Oh, if as an instructor, you have someone come to you and say, my classmate is cheating and using ChatGPT, what does that conversation look like?
I'm imagining an elaborate sting operation with microphones and things like that. Right? By the letter of the law, students, when they see something, are supposed to, they're obligated, just as instructors are obligated to report things when they see a violation. Students are obligated when they see, these two students were cheating sitting next to me in class and I witnessed it. I'm supposed to go to the instructor and say, I saw these two cheating. It should be the same with this. So it really comes down to how can we verify this and how can it be something more than just, well, they were talking about cheating. How do you get to the point where it's conclusive? And I think it's great for a student to come forward and say, I'm really worried about this because, you know, especially if it's something like a team project and my teammates were talking about cheating on this and I don't want to get busted for it. I'm not involved in the cheating. You know, that's something that at least if the instructor knows about that in advance, if something fishy comes up afterwards, the student who wasn't involved in it can say, you know, 3 weeks ago, I told you that they were going to do this. So don't punish me about it. But it's still, I think, the penalizing the students who have done it, if they've done it artfully enough, even though you have all of these indicators that they probably did something illicit, without clarity on that, it becomes really difficult. So again, it's setting up some sort of sting operation in which the student goes to the other ones and would you allow me to record you saying this? I'm not sure how you operationalize that.
But I think you could then be more attentive to that student's writing then, right? If a classmate accused that person of using AI, and then you could be more attentive to that, and just like you would if you noticed it on your own, be more attentive to it. But
Would you approach the student for a discussion?
Yeah, a preemptive discussion.
Like, is that appropriate?
It's come to my attention
Yeah,
that there are concerns about this. I'd just like to have a one-on-one conversation with you just to reiterate what my position is on this. So that at that point, even if they use it, it's, you know, it's been moved to the forefront of their mind. And again, for all the reasons that we've talked about, they can still use it in a way that we can't necessarily do anything about. But if they think that we're going to do something about it, that may be enough for them to not use it.
If the student was coming sort of in a manner where they're reporting that it has happened, not that it's going to happen, I'm just curious, would having like multiple indicators, meaning like having student reports plus maybe the Turnitin results, would that make a stronger case, or is that still like we have to have them admitting it?
I still think it's going to be hard to quote unquote prosecute a student without them giving it up at that point. And I think that the conversation could be had in such a way as to make them think that all hell is going to be loosed on them. And perhaps at that point they give it up. But yeah,
That's how I went into my conversation. One of the cases Paul's talked about, it was one of my students, but that's how I went into the conversation with them as well. Not that all hell was going to break loose, but I just laid it out that sort of, I know, you know, what's happened, and I'm going to ask you about it now, and your responses to these questions will, you know, influence what we do going forward. And I don't know if I was lucky or if that process just worked, but he did just, you know, lay it out exactly what he had done.
Yeah. I think maybe not exaggerating when you're talking to the student, but being frank with what your position is. It's completely legitimate, and if there's any doubt in their mind about your ability to penalize for this, then that conversation could be enough to cause them to admit to the wrongdoing. And if you come out and say, if you admit to doing this, and if you show me exactly how you use this, I might be able to understand better what your thought process was, which could lead to a different idea for penalty. So it's not just you're going to fail this class or you're going to fail this class or assignment. But if you allow me to understand why you use this and in what way you used it, then we might be able to discuss alternative ways or ways of recouping lost points or something like that. And I think that allowing a student enough room to admit that they're guilty and allow them to, to get back to goodness,
Come back, yeah.
by doing something that shows that they actually did meet learning outcomes and they're willing to do that work. That's a good outcome, I think.
I have a quick question, Paul. So first of all, I'm in physics, and in physics, I try to give fresh problems, and in classwork, group work, quizzes. So I'm a little bit out of the loop with ChatGPT. This is why I try to participate to some workshops. But from the point of view of the student, do you have any idea, you John too, about companies which may use this and may allow their workers, the employees to use this system? Because then if our students get employed by such companies, they don't know how to use it, and they lose points comparing to their colleagues who may know very well how to use it and how to use it towards their benefit. So do you know how companies deal with this? Because in another workshop, I was very surprised to hear that faculty use it even in common emails and so on. So I was a little bit puzzled about it and surprised. So I thought, okay, where is the creativity? Where is one person's work? But then again, from perspective of our students, will they need actually eventually to learn how to work with it such that they will be competitive with other students who perhaps in other universities are allowed to use this? So again, this is a little bit devil advocate, but again, I have never used it and I don't know much about it, but I'm just, thinking about the future of our students as employees and how all of this would work at a higher level for them. Do you have any idea how those companies work?
Yeah, I mean, there is a clear, important role for this technology in society going forward. And I think we're responding to that. The School of Business has a class that is centered around this in the coming semester. So I think the flashpoint is using it versus using it to try to convince someone that it's your own work. If you're using it to help generate ideas, to help get started in something that's difficult to start, great. If you're using it to automate a task which is monotonous and really just not a productive use of your time, great. But if you're using it to generate something that your instructor thinks is going to be coming from you, then we've got to collectively be able to inform students that that's where the line definitely is. And so
one of many students' first interactions with a campus is with the chatbot that we provide to students with questions. But yeah, there are some actually studies already coming out. Two MIT graduate students in economics just published a paper about a month ago where they worked with firms that allowed people to use ChatGPT in their day-to-day tasks. And one of the interesting things they found is that it had virtually no effect on the productivity of workers who had been in the job for 5 years or more, but it dramatically increased the productivity of new workers in the firm because they were able to be as productive as the workers with more experience. And so that's a case where they found explicitly that it then tended to narrow the gaps between skilled and less skilled or less experienced workers, which again does have some implications in terms of pay, because it means you can replace more highly skilled workers with fewer skills, which may very well lower the return to education. there's a lot of cases where if you look at holiday movies, they could be easily generated. The script could be easily generated
Hallmark Channel.
by an AI tool. But there's lots of occupations. Before the session started, Scott mentioned using an AI tool for a realtor.
For a real estate agent. She was on the Spectrum News last night that she does the description of the house through Chat GPT, and then she goes over and actually plugs in some certain details specifically with the house, but it saves her a lot of time and effort. Some senators and congressmen have admitted to using it for some of their bills that they're trying to pass through in Congress. That they
Right,
admit to
because you can
using
put
that
your
as
own
well.
content in and it will create the the paragraph for you. If you put your own
You can,
content,
and you
it
can have
will
it
create it.
reconstruct things.
yeah.
And it's used for summaries and some legal work people have been using to generate summaries of more elaborate briefs, because by itself, you're limited in terms of the amount of input, but there are other AI tools that will take a complex document, break it down into chunks, summarize the chunks, and then feed the chunks into ChatGPT to write up a summary of the overall document. A really interesting discussion occurred on a podcast that came out actually the last 2 weeks of Planet Money, where they have a podcast generated using ChatGPT all the way through, except for interviews with 2 economists. The podcast generated talked about the transformations in the labor market caused by the introduction of automatic switching networks in telephone systems, and how it essentially took the most popular jobs for women between the ages of 19 and 25, and essentially eliminated all of those within a couple of decades. But all the questions, the dialogue, and so forth, and the intros were generated using AI tools, including the voice of one of the hosts, which was synthesized based on a different AI tool. And and they discussed the whole process of creating it and so forth. They've had 2 episodes on it. They're going to have a 3rd one where the first one, they talked about how they generated the questions. And actually the economists who were interviewed, who had written the original study, had commented that, because they were asking about AI tools and whether they could replace workers. And one of them said, well, these interview questions could not have been created by AI, when in fact they had been, and they revealed that later. So it's moving incredibly rapidly after decades in which people were really discouraged by the lack of progress in this area. We're not going to go backwards in terms of technology. Students will be living in a world where this is pervasive.
Until the zombie apocalypse. And then
Or until the AI apocalypse.
But I think your point about helping our students understand how to be, again, consumers of this technology, and not for them to be at a disadvantage when they hit the workforce, but how to use it to, like in the School of Ed, generate reports, let's say, or it's almost like having a template, and then you fill in those specific details, maybe about a student or whatever. So, I think that there's some value in incorporating into our class assignments, especially, or maybe not especially, but at the graduate level, possibly, to really help them be that much more prepared for work, for the profession, for the role.
Yeah, I've heard of research that's been going on with using AI in crisis response and things like that. And the thing that I hear is that the research that is being done is pointing to great outcomes and positives. But there's a part of me that says, when you're dealing with people in highly emotionally charged situations, there's really a call for a human element. So there's got to be there's got to be both. It's not something that solves all problems, that puts everyone out of jobs, but there are still a few things that humans can do pretty well.
Well, the transcripts for this episode, because it's on Zoom, will be generated by
Right.
Otter.ai, which is something we've been using for our podcast for several years. And we used to have our work study students or our grad students go through and clean up those transcripts. But what's been happening for the last year, at least, is that the work done by students ended up making the transcripts worse than the version generated by AI. So I've had to go back to do that final editing. So I'm not sure if that says more about our students, and the changing students we've had.
Next
But,
topic. Next topic.
but it does also.
But
suggest
don't you
that
think that the transcripts that are now created are more accurate?
they're far more
than they
accurate. And
were a
that was
couple
my
years.
point. That it was
Really?
pretty easy to catch mistakes before, because now it's become much more accurate. And
Yes.
the level of complexity has to do with more complex sentence structures, or with words that are more technical that our students just don't know.
Yes.
And those were minor things that used to be left behind by the student editing. Now, the sentence structure that AI generates is far better than the revisions that our student workers had made. So.
Everyone feeling positive and enthusiastic about this.
I will not be doing any sting operations in my classroom. I'm leaving that part out of whatever happens this year.
All right, so
But thank you for the suggestion.
In the next hour, I think Mamta and I are going to talk about some assignments we've started incorporating into our classes. But my takeaway is that, in terms of getting back to Carolina's question, the skills that students are going to have to know in order to sort of navigate the academic dishonesty policies are probably the same skills they're going to need in the workplace when they get out there. They're going to need to know an appropriate way to use it versus an inappropriate way to use it. And so I think at this point, getting that to them early is important. So almost as soon as I had the big case that happened with Paul, I had it in my class that semester, because I thought students need to know what it can do well, what it can't do well. And especially because I was teaching research methods. So like, how do you take this tool and understand what it can and can't do with research? So yeah, we're going to talk about that a little in the next hour if you're interested.
A little preview.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And John, I am curious. I know you mentioned a lot of these like additional plugins that can be used and that basically can do anything. And I'm curious, I might be naive, but I kind of think that the students who are trying to pass work off as their own, the majority of them, in my opinion, probably aren't using those plugins. They're only using the basic.
Many of them have only been available for the last 3 or 4 weeks, and it does take a little while to develop the expertise. And the students who are most likely to do it tend to be really, really lazy, and it requires a little bit more time and effort to use those tools, and if they're going to devote that much time and effort to it, although on the other hand, when students try to argue for a higher grade because they missed something, they'll spend so much more time arguing for that grade than they would have spent had they actually done the work they were required to do earlier. So. But yeah, so at this point, I don't think we have to worry about that so much, but that's sort of what people were saying back in early December about ChatGPT for the spring semester, and it spread pretty rapidly from what I've seen in my classes. And so far, I've only really had the conversation with 3 students in the last semester, plus the first 2 weeks of the summer school, and they all admitted it pretty quickly. So, students do tend to admit it when you ask them, where this came from and why does it not respond to the actual questions you were asked. And they generally were pretty quick about that. So.
Great. Thank you, everyone.